Today we'll be looking at bias in surveys and just in bias in general, and how that can go and impact the way that we collect data and how we analyze it. We've learned a number of different sampling techniques, and those are supposed to cut out a lot of bias by taking away what influences us as to who we survey and who we don't. But beyond that, there's other forms of bias that can be inherent in the questions that we ask or how we look at it. The reality, though, is that bias is way bigger than just what shows up in survey questions. It's deep within us, and it's impacted by our background, by our wealth, by our heritage, our culture, country of birth. It's impacted by so many different things. And in ways, when you're looking at designing a survey, you don't think of any of those other factors, but they're what influences the type of question you ask, the options that you put down, and what you're kind of aware of in your universe. So when you're creating a survey or trying to collect data, the key is to get it edited by other people, get a lot of different eyes on it so that they can hopefully identify some of those unintentional or inherent biases that can be there too. In terms of data management, though, when it comes to designing a survey or collecting data, there's four main types of bias that we look to and look to avoid. And the first one is sampling bias. It's by far the biggest kind of issue that we have to address. And that occurs either when there's a bad sample is chosen or the data collection method itself is flawed. Either way, if this happens, the sample does not reflect the actual population. The biggest force of sampling bias we can have is way too small of a sample size. Anytime you're only surveying 5, 10, even 20 people, that's not going to be enough. There's no way you'll get a representative sample. But sometimes we just choose a wrong group, or there's just something that's completely wrong with how the data is collected. For example, grade 12 students are asked if data management is an appropriate prerequisite in place of calculus. When I went through high school, almost anyone going into science or math had to have functions and calculus. Now there's a lot of programs where universities are saying, actually, data management is strongly recommended here. But if you were to ask grade 12 students, that's a sampling bias. It's the wrong group to ask. You're going to get the biased opinion of those that are either in data management or aren't. So the proper sample to ask for a question like that would be university professors who have seen students that have not taken data or have, asking undergraduate students, so those that are currently in university, and of course, people that are in the industry too. So what we discovered is that about 20 years ago, when the math curriculum was rewritten, is that a lot of these other groups said, students coming into university may know calculus and functions, but they don't know basic statistics. And especially they haven't used spreadsheets or been able to deal with large quantities of data. And that's why there's more of a push for this course that you're currently in. Second sampling or second type of bias that we have is called a non-response bias. And this very simply is when you're not responding. You're just not able to do the survey for whatever reason. This can happen in lots of different ways too. Groups in the population are underrepresented because they chose not to participate or they could not participate. And non-response bias covers so many different things. Questions that are left blank on a survey. So someone that answers the first 5 questions and then leaves the last 3 blank, that's a non-response bias on the last 3. When you hang up on someone that calls for a phone survey, when you walk by someone on the street that wants to ask you questions for a survey or to try to collect information for a nonprofit agency. Any of these times where you close a link, a pop-up survey or a pop-up question shows up when you're online, an Instagram survey, any of these that you don't answer all result in a non-response bias for that person. And then sometimes there's much more specific ones too. For example, I've attended Trent University and also Queen's and Western for my education programs. And there's this, Maclean's magazine puts out a massive university ranking each year. It's a really good thing to look at just to see a bunch of different views on Canadian universities. And both Western and Queen's always showed up in the perception of universities. So what do graduates think about it? And I noticed that Trent University, where I did my math and environmental science work, was never included in that. So looking kind of at the fine print, there was a couple of schools that never made that survey. And the little asterisk beside it said it was because less than 10% of their graduates filled out this optional survey on their perception of the university. And that didn't surprise me because often there's a bit of a extra sense of value in our school if you go to a better known, so to speak, school like Queen's or Western, where graduates can take a lot of pride in the name. And for me, attending Trent University, it wasn't the kind of thing, even though I love the school, it's not the kind of thing where I'm going to wear the sweater or jacket or go out of my way to fill out a survey for that. And so that resulted in a non-response bias, enough so that Maclean said, we just don't have enough people to include in the rankings. Probably the most famous example of a non-response bias actually came out of a very old story involving the Chicago Times, which was a big newspaper at that point. They had a very wealthy readership. It was primarily in the business community, those that lived in the richer areas of Chicago. And a challenge that newspapers had at that time is that when an election was occurring, whether it was for president or a mayor or someone in their state, the newspapers often didn't have the information by press time. And so at that point, you would have newspapers that might start getting printed at 10, 11 o'clock at night. And if the race was too close to call, they wouldn't be able to publish on the front page of their next day's newspaper who won. So the Chicago Times decided that they were going to do their own polling, their own surveying of their readership, and try to get an idea ahead of the election who was actually going to win. They were so confident with their result that their big front page headline declared the winner of the election, and it was the exact opposite person that won, and not by a little bit. They really lost. So the non-response bias here is that the only people filling out the survey were those that read their newspaper and that kind of participated in that. And there was a huge upsurgence of the working class community in Chicago that were just so upset by the bad working conditions and poor government support that they really mobilized and voted that entire government out and put in their own more people-focused government. So a big change and really embarrassing for the newspaper to have on the front page of every paper the wrong winner the next day. Third type of bias is a measurement bias. This is the one that I find the trickiest because it's not, people do respond, it's not that you have the wrong group. Measurement bias, you could kind of add even to your sheet here, it's more the one that manipulates, the one where you intentionally go and alter the question or unintentionally to kind of put people towards your own bias or opinion. So this is when the data collection method is flawed in that it consistently under or overestimates a certain group of the population or a certain opinion of the population. And this is a case where we say that the result will show the trend. You'll see an overall graph or trend of what's happening, but it tends to get skewed to one side or the other. The other thing that we link with this are what are called leading and loaded questions. So a leading question is when you ask a question on a survey that kind of brings people in one direction, or a loaded question where it's just the bias is so evident as to what you want them to answer or what your opinions are on it. So examples are trickier here. It's just any question that intentionally manipulates or directs you in one direction. And then sometimes it's not a question even, it's just a data collection method. So for example, police officers that have the radar systems to go and record speeding, being told, hey, if you're on break, if you're writing up a report on the side of the road, we just want general data on how much people are speeding. So throw the radar on, let the computer record the speeds. You don't have to go after anyone, but we'll just have that data down. Well, come on. What's the first thing you do if you see a police car, even if you're not speeding? It's instant like reaction going for the brake. And so in that case, there's no way that you're going to have the same kind of accurate data occurring there, you're going to get data on speeding, but it's going to be more skewed in one direction as opposed to just putting up a sensor, unmarked sensor, something where people have no idea as they're going by. Often in measurement bias too, it's just making the question simpler. So not including information about the person or about the question, but just asking the most specific, concise question that you can so that you're not pushing it in one direction or the other. And our last type of bias, this one we tend to see more in school settings, or if you have a community group or a place where people kind of know each other. You walking around our classroom or getting data directly from students in our class could definitely be a response bias too. Anytime I have students go and create questions online, where you post a survey and everyone answers and you can publicly see each other's answer, I'm always watching for a response bias, assuming that there will be some lying, assuming that there will be people that are maybe asked a bit more of a personal question that will purposely not answer truthfully because they don't want their name attached to it. So a response bias is when participants deliberately give false or misleading answers, and it can be out of embarrassment or just a desire to influence the results. And there's so many examples of this. One of the most classic ones, just a principal or vice principal asking anything to students where they could potentially get into trouble. So asking if students cheat on a test is obviously going to be a bias there. Other ones, just the principal or vice principal in the school asking anything that might get a student suspended, anything that could have a negative impact on their mark as far as plagiarism, you're going to get a response bias. Doctors asking how much you smoke or drink, or a doctor asking any kind of medical related question where your choice shows an impact on your health. So how is it going to skew it? There's a good chance you're going to give misleading or less information, or maybe just flat out lie out of embarrassment or to go and avoid a lecture. I believe that everyone that goes to a dentist gives some type of response bias. Do you brush your teeth 3 times a day? Do you floss your teeth every day? What are those kind of questions that you might not answer perfectly honestly, but kind of go in the middle of the road? An example when I was in university of a clear response bias was a first-year psychology course I took. And any of you that take courses in university like psychology or sociology will quickly find out that they tend to use those large groups of classes to do different surveys or studies. And often you can get some bonus marks added onto your mark, or sometimes there's even an honorarium or payment for being part of these studies. And it's because they get such a huge group of students that are the same age, in the same kind of program to be able to study and collect information from. So before the long weekend that went into the Easter weekend, in my psychology class, I had a lecture that was late on the Thursday night. And so we were now going into a 4-day weekend. They ended the lecture a little bit early and then said, anyone that wants to participate in this, it will be 1% added on to your final mark, but you have 200 multiple choice questions to go and complete. And these were not easy multiple choice questions. These were complicated ones about your psychological thinking. They often would do things like give 3 options, and then there would be a 4th option that would say A and B, but not C, and then another option that would say all but B. And it was just a lot to think through. Most of the questions were linked to anger or anger management or something like that. And I tell you, by the time I was like at the 20th question, the anger was rising up in me. I kind of wish that I hadn't participated in this and was just looking at a bunch of questions. Then I started to notice a couple of weird things that were happening in this lecture hall of probably 600 students. The guy beside me was just doing a zigzag pattern down the multiple choice bubble sheet. He did not care. He was finishing this thing as quickly as possible and then walking it up. I noticed a couple of other people that when they saw how complex it was, they just kind of, I'm out of here, would go and return it to the professor and the teaching assistants that were sitting at the front. So just my personality being what it was, I completed most of it. Some of them I started to skip through. And then as I went down and passed my sheet in, I noticed 2 things. They had a timer there and they recorded the time that I finished and wrote it right on the sheet. And then I also noticed that in front of each of the teaching assistants who were graduate students, they had this whole kind of picture of facial expressions. And it was just like a whole range of kind of like these just pictures that showed a wide variety of facial expressions that people would have. And nothing kind of being done with it, just noticed they were there. So I left, I figured I got my 1% and everything was fine. And it was just annoying, that I missed a bus and my long weekend was that much delayed. The next week when we were in class, the professor said, I'm sure there's questions about the anger survey. I thought I would just explain our methodology. He said, as soon as everyone left, we took all of your papers, just recorded the time that it took you to finish it, and we put them all into the recycling bin. We didn't look at any of them. He said, the purpose of the study was not your questions. It was to see in a frustrating, anger-inducing situation, how long would you endure it? How long would you stay around? And all we did was record the time you stayed and then what facial expression you were showing as you walked up towards the desk to hand in your test. That was it. Their whole study was set up to manipulate first-year psychology students to see what we could endure in a professional setting when we were being told to do something. It was a really good lesson for me to look a little bit more deeply into what's happening and what information is being asked of you, but also just to see the incredible bias that we can bring into surveys too.